there was also an ending to the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic system, and the Mosaic age, right? The age of Moses, which was roughly a 2,000-year period. And so that age of law was coming to an end. And what was dawning was the age of Messiah, the age that we're in now, the kingdom age, the new covenant age. And there was actually a 40-year window of time where you had two covenants that were overlapping each other. And you're thinking, Leo, what is this? What do you mean?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to I guess, a series I'm calling Revelation Revealed, Seeing Jesus Beyond the Fear. I've got a guest I'm super excited about. We'll get to it in just a moment, but let's really be honest. Revelation can be and is sort of intimidating. If you've ever skipped it, ignored it, or felt like it just didn't sound like Jesus, you're not alone. I was that guy. For many, many years in my spiritual walk, I just felt like I didn't want to go there. It seemed like it was a hot point. People would argue over it. And so we're going to discuss that. What if the problem isn't the book, it's how we were taught to read it or the context? So here's what we're going to do. I think this is going to be 3 episodes. Before we dive into the beast, the trumpets, or 666, Antichrist, all that stuff, we need to really ask ourselves, who was Revelation written to? When was it written? Why? What was going on in the world first century when it was delivered? And I'm excited. I've got a guest, Leo De Siqueira, and on my journey in, I guess, discovering more, I'm not going to pretend like I've got it all figured out. Leo wrote 3 books. He's written 4, but there were 3 that were significant in my journey. And so I'm excited to have him here. We're going to go over some things that'll help us rediscover the foundation. And I'll tell you, if you're just getting started with this journey, it's going to change everything for you. Let me give a quick intro. Leo De Siqueira is what I would call a revelation scholar. He might can correct that, but theologian, linguist, who approaches the text through the lens of Aramaic, which is the language of Jesus, the language of first century, and the historical first century context. His work uncovers a hopeful, victorious, and present tense message of Christ's reign, not a fear-filled future timeline. Leo, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. What a great introduction that was.
Thanks, man. Do you call yourself a scholar? I mean, scholar is kind of like a heady word, isn't it?
I call myself a student. Lifelong learning program with Jesus.
I had somebody on social media kind of bouncing back and forth with, what do you think, you're some kind of scholar or something? I said, man, the more I think I figure out, the less I feel like I know. Where are you on that scale?
Yeah, I mean, you know, certainly you can recognize the spiritual gift of, say, like teacher, and certainly I love to teach and empower. But I do approach it from this childlike stance of like, hey, we're always learning. You have to be teachable, you have to be humble. You got to be worried about the guy who's arrived.
I used to be that way. I think I was that guy.
Mm, yeah.
Have you ever been like, was there ever in your journey a time where you said, man, I know this stuff, and now you look back and wish you could coach yourself?
Oh man, that was my 20s and early 30s, right? It's just you think you've figured it all out and you're invincible and you're on top of the world and everybody's wrong but you. So God takes you down the 40-year journey through the wilderness to have that stuff die off.
I've interviewed folks that have written books for, 50 years. And I said, is there anything you would change? They go, oh yeah, I'd go back and redo half the books I wrote and all that. You and I are recording this, and I believe it's going to end up being 3 episodes just with the massive content that you've got in all your books. I've got 2 of them sitting here. I actually originally read them on my Kindle. And there's just massive amounts of stuff that you went over, footnoted, and things like that. People are going to need to get the books to really dive into it. But you and I are sitting here on a Saturday morning. I'm just kind of giving the listener, and I can't tell you I mean, maybe there's some things I would rather be doing, but I can't think of many things at this stage of my journey that I would rather be doing than sitting here on a Saturday morning talking for a few hours about Revelation with somebody like you. Does that make any sense? Is that weird?
I love it. I love it. And I ponder it often. So, yeah, to me, this is great. Good way to
Well,
start the day.
was there ever a time that you avoided Revelation in all this conversation? Was there ever a time you avoided it, or have you always embraced it?
I think I always embraced it. I mean, I grew up in a what I would call a left behind household. My dad was a pastor and we'd watch Jack Finimp on Sundays, and it was always some headlines predicting, all the crazy things leading up to the tribulation and the antichrist and all that stuff. And so that was normal for me to think about that. And then my world kind of really changed when I went to Bible college and was just blown away with a broader framework that was in motion, starting with God's story in Genesis, but then looking at the early church. And I think early church history is what really fascinated me, early Roman history, Jewish history, and what was going on in that time. And then all of a sudden, the book of Revelation starts to become a really key piece, to the people in the first century. So that's kind of where the journey shifted. And I never felt like challenged. I felt enlightened. It was just kind of like, this makes a million times more sense than just grabbing random headlines and trying to correlate them with verses. I mean, you can do that ad nauseum. Um, it just didn't make any sense in that sense. So
Hmm. Did
always,
any
always pondered it.
I think some of these things nagged at me, even though, like you sort of mentioned, and I've talked about it in just some recent episodes, how this thought process, this mindset, call it more of a fear-based gospel, which I know those words don't go together, but I've crammed them together anyway. And I realized it was sort of baked into just my thinking. You find things coming out of your mouth like, oh, that's a sign of the apocalypse. And oh, yeah, I'm going to do this until Jesus comes back and all these things. I used a matrix analogy recently that once you see certain things, and I think some of these things we're going to look at in this first episode, and then I think we'll really look at them in episode 2 and 3. But
Mm.
I think there's a certain point that once you step over certain lines, certain facts, certain historical things, certain contextual things, whatever, it's like you can't see this in the old way or the way I used to. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are really, really stark analogies, and I hope it doesn't offend anybody, but you go back to the first century and Jesus' intentionality in making women feel seen and known, right? Even in the fact that women were the first to testify of the resurrection. I mean, this stuff is very intentional to a culture that um, just had no framework for elevating women in a social status, and making them equal to men, for instance. And Jesus was very adamant about that. And so I feel like our framework has this cultural embedding, right? Like Western civilization, but not just what, because if you look at the UK, they do not see the way that we see things. It's not ingrained in their culture like it is in the US and in Canada. And I would even say Latin America. So it really is this cultural undoing, right? It's normal in the sense that it's been seeded for a couple hundred years now, but that's okay. We can still overcome that. Just because it's a cultural norm doesn't make it right.
Yeah, and I think in episode 3, we might get to where that deception arose. You mentioned a couple hundred years. We'll tease just a little bit with that. In your first book, in your Revelation series, I do want to mention this to people because we are not going to have near enough time, even in 3 episodes, to go into the depth. Truthfully, the footnotes that you've got, Leo, are this is not a negative, almost overwhelming. But In your first book, for those that are watching this, I'm gonna just hold up a copy. This is the Dawn of This Age. This is your part 1. This is my words. You may have some different words. Correct me if you need to. That you kinda lay the foundation for what you're gonna be looking at in Revelation.
Mhm.
And I wanna maybe preface this where I wanna talk to 3 audiences over the course of these next few episodes. I wanna talk to the person that might be just stumbling on, and they may not have any paradigms about Revelation like you and I did, about the left behind and, rapture, Antichrist, all this kind of stuff. They may not even have that. And then I also want to consider that audience of those that are pretty hardcore, because I think these kind of titles draw them in because they love to argue with what we're talking
Mhm.
about. The
Mhm.
pretty hardcore. And then the ones that I really love talking to recently, the ones that are on that discovery journey. They're
Mhm.
somewhere down that path, and so I'm setting that up almost for you and I to gauge that, but also to let the listener know we're gonna attempt to hit all 3 of those, so hang with us as we go through here, but let's start off. What do we need to know
Mhm.
before we even dive into Revelation and start picking apart all of the scriptures and the symbolism and the literal timelines? Just a little bit of a joke there, sorry. Revelation
Yeah.
joke. Anyway, what do we need to know? Talk to us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share my journey in the sense that I always wanted to understand God's love story for humanity, and that's how I preface it, right? And I think that's really where every student, or at least the person who's curious, has to begin. What are we doing here? What's the big why? So it's unfair to just dissect a book of the Bible, right? Try to pick it apart, come up with hypothesis and then argue to defend them. I think it's actually quite narrow minded. There's a huge narrative in play with a lot of mystery, mind you. And that's really where it begins. It begins for anybody who wants to approach the book of Revelation. What are we doing? What is God's story? Like Revelation says that the lamb was slain before the foundation of the world. Like, what does that even mean? And of course, I talk about that because I think it's a very profound statement. But this is what we're dealing with. It's like there's something that's been in play even before creation began, right? And so our binary view today in our postmodern Western evangelical culture that has skewed and narrowed what we call the gospel to saved or damned, in or out, right? Left behind or raptured. Oh man, what a disservice. The fascinating thing is like these themes are so common for us, and yet I would invite anybody to find a discourse anywhere on the Bible that specifically teaches these things. You have to really force those themes to come to life by cherry picking a couple of random verses here and there. What we actually see throughout the Bible consistently, and this is in the books, the law and the prophets, and then the gospels, is that there's always this theme of restoration. And even in the heaviest prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, as scary as the judgment verses are, they are always followed by verses of restoration and reconciliation. This thematically is consistent throughout the corpus of scripture. And that's what I think the invitation is for us, is to understand that God consistently is looking to restore, right? And you talked about Genesis earlier this morning. Genesis and that garden experience is ultimately where we're heading. And when I teach this in person, I generally have a whiteboard and I say, we're going from garden to garden, from Eden to Eden. Now, the how is the mystery, right? Because it spans a vast amount of time, right? Cultures, covenants, but ultimately it's unto restoration.
And restoration's a big word, and I love that you bring in the mystery. My mind, I know your background's in finance, and so you deal with real numbers in a real world, and I'm an engineer and I like real tangible type descriptions.
Mm,
There, I guess mystery is the best word. And I think when we attempt to describe or explain mystery, maybe that's where we start getting into some trouble.
mm,
But let's start off with something that was key for me in my journey, and that was what was going on in the first century
mhm,
when this occurred. I went to Bible school for a few years, and you know what, Leo? We never discussed the context of historical significance. We were always taking scripture and trying to apply it to what we're doing today, which is not a bad thing, but if you're not taking it in context. So I'd love for you to discuss maybe some things around when Revelation was written, maybe if there's some authorship that needs to be discussed. Some people will want to know, who was it written to? Why was it written? Just hit on some of those things, because I know that that'll be helpful for almost all the audiences that might be listening in.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And just a quick parentheses, perhaps a point of clarification. When I talk about mystery, it's often quoting Paul. He uses that word a lot. He calls it the divine mystery that was hidden for the ages has now been made revealed, right? And so this is even actually core to Pauline theology, is that there's stuff that was hidden and now it's been revealed through the agency of Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit. But it's just understanding that there's a reverence there. It's kind of like your ways are higher than my ways, right? Your understanding is beyond our comprehension. And we have to be comfortable with that and actually let that give us a posture of humility of like, God knows best, right? Why didn't he stop Adam and Eve, right? Why did he choose animal sacrifices and this temple system? Like, there's a lot of mystery, and that's okay. It's like, Father, teach me, right? What are you revealing through this? And it's that posture of humility. Fast forwarding to the first century, what I did in my first book is really go through the story of God as it then expresses itself through the people of Israel, right? Who were really modeling in a microsystem what was to be a global ecosystem, right? And one nation for the many nations. There's such beauty in all the symbolism and the things that happen through the people of Israel, right? But that then takes us to this turning point. And if you don't understand the Israel story, then the first century story doesn't really make a lot of sense, because ultimately what we have in the first century, right? Jesus did a lot of things. I mean, that's a million podcasts, but as it pertains to our discussion, included in what he accomplished on the cross, there is also an ending to the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic system, and the Mosaic age, right? The age of Moses, which was roughly a 2,000-year period. And so that age of law was coming to an end. And what was dawning was the age of Messiah, the age that we're in now, the kingdom age, the new covenant age. And there was actually a 40-year window of time where you had two covenants that were overlapping each other. And you're thinking, Leo, what is this? What do you mean? Well, after Jesus' resurrection, right? That age, the age of the Messiah, right? The age of the kingdom had been established, right? The kingdom of God is at hand. So now you have people participating in the new covenant with God through Jesus. At the same time, you could head on over to Jerusalem and still participate in the sacrificial system, right? The temple was still in place, the priests were ministering, and that took place up until 70 AD. And so from 30 to 70, right, we have a season in time where two covenants were actually in force and enacted, an overlapping season. So part of the first century tension is that there's these two covenants in place, these two seasons that were still in place. And a lot of the writings of Paul, you look at Galatians, for instance, he's pleading with people that were bound to the law of Moses and saying, "You've come now to the law of grace. Why are you returning?" Well, that's a very unique season. It was only in that time period that it was possible to return to the sacrificial system and to bind yourself again to the bondage of the law of Moses. That was part of the tension. The second major thing was, by this time, and we all know this, I think, Rome had really enveloped the Mediterranean. They were a superpower, and Israel was under that oppression, eagerly anticipating a Messiah to deliver them, right? Jesus had disappointed a lot of people in that sense, in that they were expecting some sort of military leadership from Jesus, right? Clearly that was never the intent of God. So people still had that expectation, and many other leaders arose after Jesus' resurrection to try to lead coups against the Romans, right? Revolts and rebellions against the Romans. So that tension was boiling as well. And it ultimately erupted. So in 66 AD, the Jews decided, we've had enough. We are going to revolt against Rome. God is with us. This little nation is going to take on the might of the Roman Empire. I mean, this is the equivalent of, like, you know, I don't know, somebody in, let's grab like Venezuela trying to take on the United States. I mean, just what are you doing? Right.
Right.
But they were convinced that God was with them. And that led to full scale war in the Holy Land. And this is where we start to see the prophecies of Jesus fulfilling themselves, the prophecies of Paul, and a lot of the prophecies in the Old Testament as well. The third thing is, in all this in the first century, is where we actually see the end of the Mosaic age and the completion of the Mosaic covenant. So people have to understand that there was actually a start date and an end date to the law of Moses and that covenantal system. I'm not saying we dishonor the law and all that. It's not where I'm going. I'm just saying there was a legal binding agreement that people were under, and the terms of that covenant did actually come to an end at a specific point in history. So this is kind of what's happening in the first century. We can get into more details, but at a high level, that's some of what's going on.
Is it a correct statement? I think you said this, but is it a correct statement? This is some of the arguments that people may make. At the cross, Jesus fulfilled the it's interesting we use the term old covenant. They never called it the old covenant because it was the covenant at that point, the
Yeah.
Mosaic covenant. But
Yeah.
he fulfilled that. However, that covenant still existed because as long as there were still sacrifices, there were still people that were a covenant, air quotes for those that might be listening in. And so that covenant didn't technically end until the temple ended, which ended sacrifice, and without sacrifice, there was no longer a covenant. I don't know if I worded all that right, but I mean, is that sort of boiling it down to, I hate to say simple terms, anyway, pick that apart a little bit if you can.
Yeah. I mean, that's the book of Hebrews, right? So you
Yeah.
think of the fact that Hebrews was written after Christ's resurrection, right?
Mhm.
A couple decades after his resurrection. And it talks about daily sacrifices being administered and the futility of those sacrifices and understanding that Christ was the true sacrifice, right? The efficacy of the cross, right? That what the cross accomplished is multifaceted because it restores all the way to Adam before any covenant, before any law, before any system in place. But including that is the Mosaic covenant as well. And so for those who had been bound by, you got to understand, like Jesus talking about the gospel being to Jew and Gentile. Gentiles were not under the Mosaic law, right? Gentiles were not bound by that covenant. but the efficacy of the cross was also for the Gentiles, right? And so this is why we have to understand that it's multifaceted work spanning all time, past, present, and future, right? The fact that you and I today can benefit from the work of the cross means that the cross was for all time, because you and I weren't present when Jesus was crucified, right? So if he had to be alive and around, I mean, we're out of luck. But thankfully, it spans all time. So for those under the law, it was through Christ that you could receive the fulfillment of that contractual obligation, if that makes sense. So it's like, and this is really like Pauline theology. He's talking about, for those under the law, it's like the law of sin and death, right? And so then Paul grabs that and is like, therefore, like, be crucified with Christ. In other words, let that death participate in Christ's death so that you can participate in his new life, right? So there's this exchange as well. And so I actually get to, for a first century Jew that was bound by the law, my hope literally was through Christ and what he accomplished. And so this is the tension of scripture. Anytime Paul talks about Jews that go back under the law, or when he criticizes the Judaizers, those who were coming, like Paul would come to a city, evangelize it, and then this group of people called the Judaizers would come and undo everything that Paul did, right? And Paul's condemning them for doing that. Why? Because there was that tension of like, man, don't go back under that. It's literally the law of sin and death, and there is an actual consequence that is coming for breach of covenant, and that was the 70 AD event. And so Paul's like, time is running out, right? And that's where you get a lot of the urgency of the New Testament. There's not this urgency of like fire and brimstone, you're going to burn in hell forever. There's an actual judgment coming that is a consequence of the law of Moses as that season comes to an end. Therefore, come to Christ and escape the judgment of that law.
So is it safe to say that a portion of the books that we now call the New Testament were sort of a don't go back message, sort of don't, no, you've been given the ultimate answer. Don't go back to the old. Is that the message of a lot of, I mean, we do have a lot of end of days, last days messages. If you do a search to the what we call our New Testament books, it's all throughout there. And I think many
Mhm.
people have tried to take that and fast forward that 2000 plus years, but that was like a real time that they were heading to then. And don't go back was sort of the message that I pick up on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It is accurate. I mean, you know, try to get anybody in Christianity today to focus their sermons, their messages, their prophetic gifts to a people 2000 years from now. Like, who's going to care? Right? So we're going to gather on Sundays, we're going to talk about what's going to happen in 2000 years. I'm going to write books about what's going to happen in 2000 years. I'm going to get prophetic words about what's going to happen in 2000 years. And that's going to minister to people's hearts. That's going to edify them. That's going to strengthen us today. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. It makes no sense. And the book of Revelation is the pinnacle illustration of the fact that this was first and foremost to first century people, right?
Yeah.
The letters of the New Testament, the urgency of the New Testament had to do with the fact that, and here's something that we have to wrestle with today. You and I are facts guys, right? We look at the evidence. Here's the fact that you have to deal with. There was a Holocaust in the first century. 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered. As a percentage of the population, it was a very high number. 100,000 were taken into the slave trade. They were sold into the Roman slave trade. So you have the Jewish narrative. We love the Jewish story. We love David and Goliath. We love Daniel. We love Esther. The Jewish story, I'm not saying it ends. I'm saying there's a huge, unexpected event in the Jewish story where 1 million Jews are slaughtered. What do we do with that? Right? So it's sobering. So either God is ignorant, God took a blind eye, God said, I sent you Jesus. You said no. It's your problem, which I don't think God would ever do. Or we understand that this was actually part of prophecy and, again, a greater narrative that's at play. And so the urgency of the New Testament is warning of this event that was coming. And so we have to really, again, take a step back. What was happening in that time? You look at Romans 9, 10, and 11, which is this beautiful discourse which culminates in Paul saying, ultimately, all Israel will be saved. Now, however you want to interpret all Israel and however you want to interpret saved, that's another discussion. But it begins with Paul saying, I would give my own life. I would die so that my people would be saved. Well, what is he so stressed out about? It's the fact that Paul's understood the prophecies of Jesus, right? Matthew 23 and 24. This generation will not pass away until all these words have come to pass. And then you look at Luke 19 and Luke 21. Luke is like, my audience will have no grid for this. So I'm just going to paraphrase it. When you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, you know that the time is now. Luke's just like, ain't people got time for this to go back to the Old Testament and figure this stuff out. That's not my audience. Jesus very adamant about the fact that Israel is going to be surrounded. Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by Roman armies, that there's going to be devastation. Woe to women who are pregnant in those times. When you see them flee to the hills, we know from early Christian history that that event took place. It's called the Flight of Pella. And it's actually really fascinating that Christians were praying because they could feel that the time was at hand. There was stirrings, political stirrings, military stirrings, and all of a sudden an angel appears to these Christians and say, now is the time. And they all fled the holy city of Jerusalem to the Jordan region. This is beyond the Dead Sea, to the region of Pella. And it was, I don't know if it was days after that when the Romans started to besiege the city, right? It's just fascinating stuff. This is the urgency of the New Testament.
And this is historic. This is not like Leo or Tim saying, "Yeah, we've kind of assumed this." These are historical facts that have been written about by people that are actually not necessarily attached to the biblical narrative. So give just a little bit for the one that's going, how does he know this? Because I've been a Christian for 40 years and I've never heard anything
Mm,
about AD 70. And I'm saying
mm,
that with a little emphasis, Leo, but I can guarantee you that's a fact because I've been around a lot of church world and that never comes up. So give
yeah.
just some of the history, and you've got a lot of the references. We don't have to go through a lot of them, but just in general, what are some of the references of the history of that time?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first and foremost would be somebody named Josephus. Josephus was an eyewitness to those events, the Romans coming. He was actually both a Pharisee and a military general. So he had a good understanding of the law. He participated in the war and he ultimately surrendered to the Romans. What's really interesting is that he actually, what I would say, prophesied to Vespasian, the general leading that campaign, that he would become emperor, that he would succeed Nero. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And so he was allowed to live and chronicled all these events. So he was the only boots on the ground eyewitness account that we have of the siege of Jerusalem, of the Holy Land. We also have early church fathers and early church writings, and Eusebius is one that wrote church, what we would call today church histories. That was a few hundred years after Christ's resurrection. So we have very early accounts that were already documented, and that stuff is available for us even today. So there were also Roman accounts of the siege of Jerusalem as well, outside of Josephus. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius are some of the ones that would mention that siege as well.
Yeah, so this is real stuff history, not anything that's just being assumed or made up. I think what I'd love to do before we kind of dive into the next episode, all into Revelation, you talked about it just a second ago, but I'd love for you to give a take on why the words of Jesus in our Matthew 24, and there's other references. You mentioned Luke, and also there's a brief mention, I think, in Mark, but what was the significance of Jesus' words, especially in relation to what the topic is here, which is Revelation? And then I've got a couple more things before we wrap up this episode. So just mention a few things about the words of Jesus that he spoke.
Yeah. I mean, that really became my first book. And I never intended to write three books. You can't really understand Revelation without understanding the prophecies of Jesus. That was going to be just one chapter. And it simply became impossible because I started to look at the work and ministry of Jesus. There was just so much there, but then also needing to give the reader Old Testament context, right? And so all of a sudden it became so much that it became a book just in and of itself, understanding the prophecies of Jesus. So it's fascinating because it all begins with his disciples marveling the beauty of Herod's temple, right? The second temple. Solomon had built a temple. There was the Babylonian invasion. It was destroyed. We have the story of Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the temple, but it was a very simple temple. It was not beautiful at all. Herod came along and spent untold sums of money to beautify the temple, expand it, make it grand the way that it was. And so the disciples of Jesus were marveling at it. And Jesus says, you know, a time is coming where not one stone will be left on top of another. All of this is coming down. Now, this is the equivalent, I mean, to my American friends. I'm north of the border, but this is like going to Capitol Hill or something and saying, like, hey, do you see these beautiful buildings? They're all going to be destroyed. Hey, do you see the White House? It's going to be completely annihilated. Now, somebody saying that seriously, right? Somebody that you know has razor sharp prophetic accuracy, that whatever this person says is going to happen. Well, you're going to stop and say, what do you mean? And how will we know when this is going to happen, right? How will we know when these events will take place? When will it take place? And that's the beginning of Matthew 24. And so in Matthew's account, it's very enigmatic because it's weaving in prophetic references to the Old Testament. So Matthew's audience, Jewish audience, it's kind of like Matthew's just constantly hyperlinking back to Old Testament prophecies in Matthew 24. Luke, again, like I said, much more simplistic and straightforward, matter of fact, for an audience that doesn't necessarily have that Old Testament context. But Jesus very clearly saying that this generation is not going to pass away until these things come to pass, right? And then he talked about the signs of the times. What time? The time of all of this being destroyed, literally, and what that would look like. So that's the context of Jesus' words. Matthew 23 is this whole prophetic, woe to you, Pharisees, woe to you, brood of vipers, right? And again, the guilt of the bloodshed of all the prophets, all the righteous blood that was shed from Abel until now is going to fall upon you, this generation. The guilt of all of that righteous blood that was shed is going to fall upon you, this generation. Speaking of the religious leaders. So either Jesus was incredibly inaccurate, or we don't understand that none of the apostles, except for John, were alive when these words actually came to pass. So it's like, well, why didn't Paul write about the destruction? Well, he had been martyred. So sorry, wasn't around to pen it. The only one that was around to pen it was John, and he did. And that's what Revelation looks at, is taking the words of Jesus, and now John gets a download of like, this is what it's going to start to look like in fulfillment of not only the prophecies of Jesus, but going all the way back to the old covenant, right? To the Torah portion and to the prophets. we're seeing fulfillments now, and this is what it's going to look like.
What's interesting about that specific passage, Matthew 24, rapture theory mindset that I had, but I've got a note, I've got my physical Bible that I've got over here to my left, and I wanna look at something when we get to the 3rd episode of this. I actually have a note, probably about 8 to 10 years ago, and I remember I really hesitated to even bring it up to my wife. We'll sit and have coffee and discuss these type things, where I wrote out beside that, and it's something to the effect of, "I think this already happened," and then I put
Mm,
80, 70 question mark. But
mm,
I do think that's critical, and I believe it's very, I'll use the word dangerous. I think it's dangerous to say that Jesus was incorrect in that prophecy that he spoke, that we know that Jerusalem was surrounded 40 years later. We know that that temple was destroyed within a generation. I just think you're skirting some pretty difficult things in eroding the prophetic, the deity, all of Jesus there. Am I being
yeah.
overly dramatic, or is that accurate?
No, I mean, C.S. Lewis tragically wrote that, Matthew 24, I can't remember what the specific verse is, but it was the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. And it's the one where Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until these things have come to pass. And C.S. Lewis was so ingrained in his, you know, left behind worldview that he couldn't see how that possibly could have taken place. And so he discounts the word of Jesus over his doctrine. I mean, doesn't Jesus talk about that? Right? Like the traditions of man making the words of God of null effect. In other words, it's like, man, discard the doctrine first. Like, when would Jesus ever be wrong? Right? Like, this is where, again, humility and being teachable. It's like, okay, I'm clearly missing something because when would you ever be wrong? So help me to learn, as opposed to this doesn't fit into the box that I've created and now have to defend. That's a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah, truthfully, if you question that, I think it's gonna erode the entire foundation of the gospel and all that. But 2 last questions before we wrap up this precursor to discussing Revelation that we'll do in the next episode. This was an important one for me, and that is not necessarily who wrote Revelation. I believe that that's pretty well established. But the question that a lot of people have, and this really is a foundation for what we call the dispensational or the left behind theory, is when was Revelation written?
Mhm.
Because there is that important time frame of AD 70. And so a lot of people will say if it was written in the 90s, then it's 2,000 years pushed out. If it was written in about 66 to 68, man, it lines up just perfectly with all that occurred. So,
Yeah.
talk briefly here as we wrap up this first episode of who wrote it and then when was it written?
Yeah. I mean, I have no problem saying that. I firmly believe it was written by John, the beloved, the one who laid his head on Jesus' chest. And I believe that there was such a beauty to the tenderness of John's heart to be able to receive such a prophecy in a way that he would have been heartbroken, but had a tenderness to love and not necessarily be judgmental. You know, I don't think it could have ever come to Paul because I think there was so much of Paul's character, I think, might have come through. And we see Paul get pretty animated at times. John had such a tenderness about him that I think he was entrusted with that message. In terms of when, firmly believe, 66 AD, just before Nero's death, that John was visited by Jesus with this revelation. And we know that he was commissioned, right, in Revelation 10, that you must prophesy now, right? That you're seeing things that have global cataclysmic impact for the empire that surrounds your people. And now's the time to prophesy. 66 AD is my my strong conviction. Otherwise, it's commentary, not prophecy.
Yes.
It's looking back and saying, well, here's why I think these things happened. Right. But I think what's remarkable is the accuracy of the prophecy. And it is looking ahead at events that were to come. And in fact, all the books of the New Testament have a much earlier date than what we've accepted. And you and I talked about a fantastic book called Rethinking the Early Dates of the New Testament.
I think I just ordered it. You, by your recommendation, I've scanned through it, and it's Bernier's book.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one for those that might be, I've scanned it, have not read it. It's got some good stuff. I appreciate that recommendation. Anything else before we wrap up this episode 1 that we might need to know before we dive into the trumpets, the bowls, the 666, and all of that stuff in our next episode? How's that for a teaser for folks? Anything we need to know?
I'd say the last thing is again, God's big story. What are we doing and why? And really asking those simple questions. What did God have in mind when he created mankind? Right? What was his design? Unto what? Knowing all things, knowing what would take place, knowing of the fall, right? Jesus Christ making the decision to take on flesh, right? Die the way that he died before ever creating Adam and Eve. I mean, this is very profound stuff. And so asking ourselves, what is God's grand intent? That's paramount. I would also invite readers to look at the earliest followers of Jesus, the disciples of the disciples. Today we call them early church fathers. Now, some people might get turned off because they think it maybe has something to do with Catholicism or something like that, which is incorrect because Catholicism didn't come around until many hundreds of years after the resurrection. These, in other words, they were closer to Jesus chronologically than you and I are today. Therefore, I would argue that what they had received by way of teaching and by way of instruction is much less tainted than what we would have today. We're products of the Reformation. We're products of a very messy environment in the 1500s. And a lot of our doctrine comes from protesting against some of the egregious exaggerations that were taking place in Catholicism. But there's a real purity to the earliest writings, and I would invite readers to explore those writings. The disciples of the disciples, I think it gives us a much clearer message as well in terms of what God is doing, what Christ accomplished, what he intends to do on the earth, where everything is heading.
Excellent. Well, this has been fun. I've enjoyed it. I just want to remind folks that a good portion and much more detail is included in Revelation Dawn of This Age, which is your first book. And it was kind of the hook that drew me into your other 2 books. Thank you, Leo, for this. It's been great. We've got a few more episodes we're going to try to get in here. In our next episode, we're going to get into the meat of Revelation itself, a lot of the questions that always come up, the details, symbols, what it says, what it doesn't say. And I could tell you definitely will be surprised by how much has been added or twisted over time. So thanks for joining us here on Seek, Go, Create. We'll see you on the next episode.